Thank you very much, Jane, and welcome everybody to the last session of the day before the relaxing drinks and the mixer. I hope you'll stick around if you get a chance. My name's David Lurie. I'm a National Business Development Manager with AWS. I work with governments across the country. I live here in Ottawa. And this particular topic is cloud economics. We've subtitled it The Journey to Cost Optimization in the Cloud. The reason that we've given it that subtitle, it really is a journey. It's not a thing you do one step at a time. What we're going to talk about today are the multiple steps that you want to take as you learn more and become more skilled at looking at the cost aspects of the cloud. So I am pressing the go forward button, Ryan. And sorry, Andrew. Oh, magic. There we go. From an agenda perspective, here's what we're looking at covering off. We're going to talk very briefly about the AWS difference, and you may have heard this a number of times today. My focus is going to be very specifically on the financial aspects. We're going to talk about the working backwards principle, just looking at a couple of customers that have achieved significant cost optimization in AWS. Really is a target for you to talk about, if I could work backwards from the future and have my organization be there in a couple of years, what would that look like? We're going to talk about what we mean by total cost of ownership at AWS, and make sure that you then understand what is it that we do in AWS to assist with TCO in the AWS cloud. I'm going to actually move some of the levers around cost optimization, and then talk a little bit about what's next. So this is what we're going to cover over the next little bit. From an AWS difference standpoint, you will have seen a slide that looks somewhat like this today. Kind of a couple of key things. First of all, we've been building AWS since 2006, right? 12 years. We've had the opportunity to get pretty good at this. And over the course of building a set of cloud services that are resilient, scalable, secure, and so on, we've done so around the world, right? 55 different availability zones in 18 different regions, 138 points of presence. And we've announced a number of new availability zones in 5 new regions, including just this last week we announced South Africa. Why do you care about that from a cost optimization standpoint? And the case that I'm going to make to you today is really around economies of scale, right? So we'll get to that. But even if you as public sector organizations are most interested in operating only in Canada in the cloud, the implications of operating around the world is that you've got this build that's taking place, this purchase of equipment, this build of capability, which allows us to pass cost savings back to you and allows us to do innovation which benefits you around the world. So we're operating more than 125 services in the cloud in this global footprint. That's allowed us to reduce price by 67 times over the last 12 years, and we expect to continue to do so. That's also attracted a really large partner community for you. So whether you are interested in working by yourself or with consulting organizations, interested in working with SaaS providers which have built what they offer in the cloud, whether they have software that runs on the cloud. Again, because of that economies of scale, we've brought this really large network of partners together that you can benefit from. And we're extremely proud that as a result, Gartner and other major independent observers have placed us in a really significant leadership position. In the case of Gartner, that top right-hand quadrant for 7 years in a row. Okay, but why, first question, why not just continue with traditional infrastructure? Why look at the cloud at all? And we get into the cost discussion there. You're probably highly aware when you go with traditional infrastructure, what you have to do is purchase it. And you don't purchase it first. First, you got to plan. Or you got to think, what do I need? So you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about what do I need, what is the amount that I need, and you're going to go through a whole process that involves procurement, it involves legal, it involves project planners to get all this decided on, competed, ordered, delivered, built, implemented, and so on. It takes contracts, it takes costs, it takes a lot of people. So one of the first implications for cloud that you obviously want to think about, and this is obviously part of why you're in the room today, is one of the first opportunities is just simply to be able to move faster, but not to have to make a commitment up front, right? You're not signing a $10 million check and then starting to benefit from the resources. In AWS, there is no upfront commitment. You use what you want and you pay for what you use. This is an important implication for organizations. Even when you do have to deal, in some cases, with your focus is on CapEx, and the cloud is all about operational expenditures, and that's a bridge that you can overcome. But not to have to commit up front is a significant benefit. The second thing is being able to move fast, and this is as important or more important in public sector as in any commercial enterprise. The ability to serve your constituents, whether they are citizens, whether they are students, anyone that you serve, patients, bring this new capability to market faster, a new program, the budgets are put in place, and you're able to roll something out quickly to serve Canadians or serve the people that you serve. And the ability to scale that capability up and down as circumstances demand. We're going to talk a little bit about spiky workloads and how that impacts financials. And lastly, self-service infrastructure. I've mentioned you can work with partner organizations if you want to, and there's a lot of them represented here in our building today, consulting partners and technology partners alike. But we want to give you the choice. The choice that if you today in this room, while we're having this session, if you want to fire up infrastructure, start building your own data center, that you're in a position to do so. And if you want to do it a different way, you've got the opportunity to do that. These are all benefits of working in the cloud. And I want to talk briefly about two organizations that have done exactly that. First of all, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation here in Ontario. Any of you who are Ontario residents and own property, you may be familiar with MPAC. You may get an assessment notice from them every now and again. They look after 5 million plus properties worth over $3 trillion, and they basically put in place assessments for $30 billion worth of tax, which then goes through the municipalities. So the story here you can see on the slide, it's fairly self-explanatory. Before they came to AWS, they were spending 95% of their time keeping the lights on, right? Just purely maintenance, purely keeping the system up and running, and only had about 5% of the time for innovation. And they had a desire to flip that on its head. I'm going to move you just to the very bottom of this slide where it says started with a purchasing card at a spend of $50 to $100. I've met the individual who had that purchasing card. It was a young student who was handed the card by the CIO, and the CIO said, go find a way for me to spend a little bit of money and do something cool, right? And that individual went out and he discovered AWS and brought it back to his organization. So what have they done as a result of giving a credit card to a student? Well, they've gone out and they've moved some of their most mission-critical applications to AWS, including their core property valuation engine. And thinking about the financial piece, it runs 5,000% faster. It costs them 1/10 or 10% of what it used to cost them. For them, that has been an enormous financial improvement. But not just the cost piece, right? The running faster piece. And the fact, as you can see there, developers are able to roll out new features every 1 to 2 weeks instead of before when they came out every 3 to 6 months. As a result, they can be adaptable to the needs of their stakeholders, their board, people who are providing input to them. They're able to move fast. And you can read the quote there from Nicole McNeil. AWS has had a transformational effect on our business, right? And they're able to go faster and better than they ever have before. So thinking about the future, right? Thinking, where do you want your organization to be? Wouldn't you like to say this in 5 years about your own organization? And then the question is, how do I get there? Right? A similar story from the United States, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. This is the largest independent regulatory authority looking at stock exchanges in the United States. It's based in Washington, D.C., so something similar to the Ontario Securities Commission. Now, they bring in a whole lot of data, and they're an interesting case because, of course, they only run Monday to Friday, 9 to 4. That's when their core activity is, when all the markets are open. So they bring in over 75 billion records every day. They wanted a platform to be able to analyze more quickly, more cheaply, more securely that petabyte scale data that they were getting. And over the last 3 or 4 years, they've done exactly that, right? They've built a mission critical platform that their analysts can look at that data every day. They estimate they save $10 to $20 million a year using AWS. And I did hear this quote is from the Chief Information Officer talking about saving about 40%, saying, we can do things that we just couldn't do before at all, end of story. I heard another individual present from FINRA. He presented to the Ontario Securities Commission and the other provincial security commissions. And he said to them, he said, look, we're in a closed room. I'm sharing a lot of details with you that I can't share in this room. But he said, I'm telling you as one of your peers, you can do things that you could not do before. You can secure them in a way that was impossible to do before, and you will be astonished by the price. All right, so this is the story here. And again, looking into the future, this is perhaps where you want to be. So total cost of ownership, what do we mean at AWS by total cost of ownership? First of all, it's a comparative cost of ownership, right? And we got to compare with something, and that means as we talk through the subsequent slides, we really have to talk about what it is that you mean by total cost of ownership so that we can line it up side by side. We're also talking about the acquisition and the operating costs of running infrastructure, right? So we're talking end-to-end in premises. We're also talking end-to-end in AWS for the particular workloads that you're looking at. And we want to make sure that you are clear that comparing TCO isn't easy. Right? One of the many discussions I've had with customers across the country in the public sector space, especially government, is to say, well, I know what my server costs today, and I know what my server costs in AWS, and I'm not sure about the savings. We're going to talk about that. But we want to make sure that it's clear they're not the same, they're not equivalent, they operate differently. And as a result, comparing TCO isn't easy. We're going to share with you some resources at the end of this presentation. We have a team that looks specifically at TCO. If it's helpful, we'll be happy to introduce you. But let's talk about TCO. First of all, obviously when you're looking at data centers, you're looking at the cost of servers, right? Not just the servers themselves, but the racks that they're sitting on, all of the top of rack switches, the maintenance costs associated with that, any of the, whether it's software for virtualization, whether you're running on bare metal, the operating system, all the facilities costs, the space, the power, and the cooling. And I'm going to say space, power, cooling several times here. So work on this with me together. Secondly, storage, right? You're looking at hardware-based storage solutions, SAN and NAS of some sort. You're looking at the fiber channel switches. You've got your software, whether it's backup or RAID software. And again, the facilities cost. Everything is sitting in a data center, right? It's taking up space. It's using power. It's using cooling. Add in the networking piece, how you get from your racks out of your premises into the internet onto other people's premises. Any of the software associated with that and the space that it takes up. And those are the things which people tend to stop. They tend to stop with their comparison and say, I'm done. But they've left out a few things, right? One of them is IT labor. The administrative cost associated with managing and running all that equipment that we just talked about on an ongoing basis. They frequently left out some of the extras you might think around, which we talked earlier about acquisition, right? The project planning, the legal advisors, the contracting, any of the training necessary, and of course, cost of capital. And the last piece that they frequently leave out is any of the business value that associates with that. What happens to you in your organization? You're trying to deliver a program, you're trying to deliver a service. Something doesn't show up, right? Something shows up and it doesn't work. It takes longer to implement than you think. Things are not connecting together. So there's a number of items that we would suggest to you that you need to think about, not just because of your specific job role, the little department that you're in and the cost that you focus on, but organization-wide. What is the cost to my organization of making the decision to go with a particular acquisition, a particular approach? So we believe all that's relevant in TCO. Now, you as an organization may see it differently, that's fine. But we want to just lay that out as things from the perspective of being complete that we think are important. So what do we tend to see actually reflected in a TCO consideration? I've kind of signaled this already. We do tend to see an infrastructure comparison. It absolutely shows up, and people are very easily able to say, I have this server, and I compare it with this other server you're presenting with me, and I understand that. We sometimes see questions of cost avoidance and workforce productivity. For example, it takes many fewer administrators to run servers in the cloud than it does to run servers in your data center, right? So, okay, I can avoid some costs there. I can get my team working a bit more effectively. What we tend not to see is anything else on this list, right? So the question, of course, I would have for you is, are you thinking completely about the cost of offering service on-prem versus in the cloud? And that's for you to consider, okay? But so let's move to capacity. Most departments and most data centers are run at a relatively low utilization, right? We can see reports from McKinsey and Gartner and the Uptime Institute saying that most data centers are utilized at less than a 50% average. Now, some of the people in this room may be exceptional at managing utilization. You may have a very high utilization, but this is across the board. So again, think where you are. Now, why are their premises so underutilized? Well, first thing is people tend to build for peak. And what do I mean by a peak? There's a couple of different things that we could look at. One is spiky workloads. And this is where you don't necessarily know what is going to be required. You think about Ottawa. We had tornadoes just a few weeks ago, creating enormous demand on the city's website, on Hydro Auto's website, and many, many others, right? An event, a news item, a disaster, a terrible event, or something really positive like winning Olympic gold, right? So you got these spiky workloads. Maybe it's the introduction of legalization of a new product that suddenly comes to market, and that creates demand on your infrastructure. That can happen, spiky workloads. Secondly, part-time workloads. I've already mentioned, for example, Securities and Exchange Commissions and other stock exchanges, the financial markets. You're only busy during market hours, right? You may have some capacity required in the evenings and on weekends, but for the most part, your servers are only operating, let's say, 8 to 10 hours a day, Monday to Friday. That's a part-time workload, but you got to build for the peak. Lastly, cyclical workloads. So this is where you have an ongoing, regular knowledge that you will have demand. If you're in a university, you've got student registration, or you've got swimming pool registration in the city. We've got elections that are coming up, that sort of thing that we know will happen again and again. But again, we're building to peak. And why do we do that? Well, if any of you are data center administrators, right, you're very, very familiar with this. You're going to start with the fact that you're going to build to an initial fixed capacity. I'll just explain here. The colors, the white represents the data center utilization that you are using, and the black is capacity that's unutilized. And that green bar represents a fixed capacity that you purchase, implement, and run. Right? So you start off, you set that amount, you spend the money, you implement the equipment, and off you go, and you're okay, right up to the point where your white utilization hits your green line. All of a sudden, and this happens in every organization on an ongoing basis from time to time, the demand on your system is greater than your capacity to serve it, and you have an outage. And that can look different for different organizations. It can involve downtime, it can involve just a slow response, but what you have is customers, and we all have customers, whether we call them that or not, citizens, students, constituents. These people are not going to get served the way that they expect to get served. It's a lost opportunity for you as public sector organizations to serve those customers. There tends to be a loss in how they feel about you, right? The confidence, the trust, the feeling these people are not as good as I wish they were, right? And in many cases, lost revenue in a way that's impossible to measure, right? Public sector, it's hard to know what that means. But you've got an outage and it's a problem, and it tends to lead to your boss saying, that must not happen again. And as a result, you buy more equipment. Right? So you've increased your capacity, but your workload is still spiky. It's going to go up and down. And so it may be that most of the time the demand is in fact less than you originally had provisioned, but now you've spent more money. And as a result, we've got wasted money invested in hardware and a lower utilization. And guess what? It can happen again. Another outage, and the implication of another outage is you spend more money on capacity. So this tends to happen on a repeated basis, right? This is a repetitive cycle, and most organizations would like to avoid that. Well, they can do that in the cloud, but before they can get there, they need to know more about their TCO. So what do they need to think? What do organizations need to think about as they're exploring their TCO? I put that to you as capacity planners. I'd ask you, how do you plan? How many servers have you added? How many servers do you plan to add? Do you have the ability, if you need to switch your hardware on and off? And this is going to be something that's very important in terms of understanding levers that can be put in play to control costs in the cloud. Can you turn your hardware on and off, and as a result, pay only for what you use? Secondly, understanding your server utilization. You really need to understand what you're using today, how much you are over provisioning, and if there's a way to scale that back, to look at doing so. From an operational standpoint, understanding where does your data center stand in terms of the space that it has available. Are you going to run out? Do you understand what your utility bill was last year? Do you understand where it's going? And have you gotten ready for that in terms of your average and your peak power? And for those customers who are already on AWS, just thinking about optimization, have you done the things that we're going to talk about today around cost optimization? Have you turned on the levers that we're about to speak about? So how does all this play in the AWS cloud? Let's look at that. First of all, 4 major gears that you can turn to save money in the cloud. And this is where we start to get into the meat. The first is removing that over-provisioning that I've spoken about and moving to a pay-for-what-you-use model. We'll get into the details of that. But you want to shrink your usage. Secondly, benefiting from the economies of scale that I referred to before. Right? So the fact that we are continuing lowering costs and passing those on to our customers, that's something that you can take advantage of passively. Thirdly, taking advantage of pricing model choices, understanding that they exist. So we're going to talk a little bit about on-demand pricing versus reserved instance pricing versus spot market pricing. But just knowing that they exist is the first thing. Secondly is deciding what to do about it. And lastly, saving money as your usage grows. Right? So as your aggregate usage grows as an organization, the fact that you hit tiers at which you can receive volume discounts is important. And understanding, sort of third-party assessments, for example, IDC, saying that customers will have spent significantly more in their existing data centers than they can in the cloud. That, I hope, would point you towards thinking about these levers as you go forward. So just quickly recapping on capacity management then, here's two scenarios. The gold bars represent actual demand. The gray box, I'm not sure can you see the gray box around the top? Maybe not. Which represents unused capacity. So on the left-hand side, you've built the peak load. Your capacity is significantly higher than your demand, so you've got wasted capacity. On the right-hand side, building to an average load, which means that your cost is lower, but you're going to have times when you have to accept that there will be outages or there will be slowdowns in your ability to serve customers. Those are the traditional approaches. Well, what if you could change all that? Right? So one of the first things we talk about is matching your capacity to the demand for your capacity. Right? So we got a concept called auto-scaling in Elastic Compute Cloud, which is our virtual compute. Auto-scaling allows you to reduce your over-provisioning because it uses monitoring to understand your demand. It then launches resources as they are needed. And you can see here that gray overcapacity is significantly reduced relative to your actual usage. So it reacts dynamically to changes in load. And you can schedule this on a regular basis if you need to. You can optimize as you like. Kind of an important point, though, it's a free service. Right? You're only paying for the underlying resources for compute, storage, and so on. So I would suggest you, if you haven't heard about auto-scaling or if you're not using auto-scaling, you might want to ask about it. And just really easy example is just simply election night. Right? Running the smallest number of servers that you need to get ready for your initial load, and then dynamically adding servers as capacity, adding capacity as your demand requires it, and then gracefully scaling back as your demand goes down. You don't know tax time. Some of you may be interested in tax time if you work at the Canada Revenue Agency and other places like that. Having the right amount of capacity, but only for as long as you need it, and only paying for what you need it. So second gear, economies of scale. And this is really important. We call this a virtuous circle. We'd just like to walk you through. If we start up sort of the top right-hand corner around more customers. When we add customers to AWS, and we have millions today in 190 countries around the world, in virtually every economic sector that you can imagine, right? When we add customers, that results in more AWS usage. More AWS usage means that we need to build, buy, implement a greater amount of infrastructure. That allows us to achieve the economies of scale that I've referenced earlier. With those economies of scale, we can take cost out of our infrastructure, and in fact, our teams are mandated to do that. So everybody who's running a service is part of their goal every year is take cost out. And we want to take those costs and return them to our customers. So it's in our DNA to take costs out. We do that. At the same time as we're reducing prices, we're looking to enhance the services that we have, right? More services available to you. In 2017, we introduced 1,430 new products and features, right? The more services that we offer you at a reduced price, the more we get one more customer, and that circle continues. So we built a really large community of customers, of partners who use AWS, and we're passing those savings on to you. So that's the second lever. Third lever, pricing models. Just thinking about, I mentioned Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2. I talked about on-demand pricing, reserved instance pricing, and spot pricing. I'm going to describe all three of those to you. But on-demand pricing is really just exactly as you turn the lights on at home. When you flip the switch, we publicly, you start consuming power, and there's a published price for that. That's our on-demand pricing. That one's pretty straightforward. But what about reserved instance pricing? I'll come back to that slide in a moment. Reserved instances is a pricing model. It's not different kinds of instances, but it's where you say, I have a workload that is going to be in continuous usage, and as a result, I want to make sure that I've got it turned on all the time. AWS, won't you give me a deal? And the answer is yes, we will. In exchange for you making a commitment to us to use our resources, we'll give you a better price. Right? So we'll talk about that a little bit. And the spot market is about bidding on AWS's excess capacity. And as you can imagine, when we're working with millions of customers around the world, we need some excess capacity ourselves at the top of what we offer, because we want to make sure that our customers, all of them, don't max out, right? That we don't run out of capacity. So we have spare capacity and we auction that off to you. We'll tell you a little bit more about that. But when would you use reserved instances? Just first of all, and this black wavy bar here, this sine wave, could represent a usage pattern. Kind of key message to tell you is you don't use reserved instances on day one. You don't sign up for an AWS account and say, I want to reserve some instances. And the reason for that is and we talked about capacity planning a few moments ago, you need to understand your usage, right? You need to see a pattern. And on the basis of seeing a pattern, you get the idea here. But at the bottom of that sine wave, I'm always using those resources. Maybe it would be worth committing to using them and paying for them on a regular basis and kind of booking that at a lower cost. Meanwhile, I also have peaks of usage over and above that base, and I could use on-demand instances for that. And again, we're not talking about different instances, we're just talking about different payment model, right? So if you've committed to 100 hours of a particular instance type in a month, and you consume 101 hours, well, then 100 hours would be billed at the reserved instance rate, and that 1 hour would be billed at an on-demand rate. So once you understand your usage pattern, you can make a commitment and you can go from there. All right, so these are key things to understand. Why would you do that? Well, I referred earlier to the fact that there's some savings associated with this. Reserved instances can save you up to 75% over your on-demand cost. So if that first piece of analysis you're doing, comparing your on-premises cost to your to cloud server, gives you X versus Y, and we tell you that, by the way, if that's something you use regularly, you want to use a reserved instance, we can save you up to another 75%. That's a different equation, right? You've added an extra variable. Not only do you get the savings, but you also get a capacity reservation, so you absolutely know for sure that you won't have capacity issues. The reserved instances can be committed to for 1 year or 3 years. And importantly, it's not just EC2 that they're available in. Certainly the relational database service, RDS, which is our managed relational database service. DynamoDB, which is our NoSQL database. Redshift, which is our petabyte scale data warehouse. And Elasticache as well. These are all areas where you can buy reserved instances. But you do want to understand your usage pattern. That's really key. Spot market, similarly, this is not a day one thing. This is really expert usage here. But this is around bidding on our spare capacity and saving up to 90% of the on-demand price. Well, what circumstances would that be? It wouldn't be for every workload, especially, again, on day one or even day 90, you might not be running a production workload on spot. But applications that have flexible start and end times, right? Batch processes, particularly well suited for this. Processes that can be interrupted and restarted. I'll just give you one example, a newspaper chain here in Canada. They are slowly digitizing their paper archives, right? Decades and decades of paper files. They're scanning, they're doing optical character recognition, they're saving those files and making them available to everyone. They're doing this using thousands of spot instances every evening and paying an extraordinarily low amount to do so. And they're getting it done as those spots are available. Second type of workload would be applications that only make sense when you can get them at extremely low prices, right? So people are being very creative around this, and in some cases following the spot market around the world over a course of 24 hours to put themselves in a position to operate. Public sector, Canada, may or may not be a fit, but just to be aware of that. And lastly, users with really large compute needs that come up on fairly short notice, they just need a lot of capacity. And again, that could be associated with the introduction of a new program, something that's very urgent. But so Spot is worth paying attention to, just because it's something that's so different than you can offer in your existing environment. But there are two important rules that you need to understand, two simple but important rules. The first is spot market pricing changes. right? This is all about supply and demand. And if the supply of the particular instance type that you're interested in goes down, the price is going to go up, and it could go beyond the point that you're willing to pay. So you bid a price. Let's say you bid 20 cents per hour for a particular instance. If the market is dictating the price is 10 cents, you only pay 10, right? You bid 20, but you only pay 10. It goes up to 11, you pay 11. It goes to 12, you pay 12. So you pay the market price right up to the point of achieving your bid. At the point where the price dictated by the market goes higher than your bid, you're going to get notice that you're going to basically be kicked out of those instances, and then you need to put in place a process to either get ready to shut down your workload or to migrate it to an on-demand situation, or take another action, whatever makes sense to you. But because you get these notices programmatically, you're programmatically able to take action as a result. So you don't want to run your production workloads on spot unless you've got extraordinarily good load balancing capability, right? But you want to be aware that it exists and it can save a lot of money. The fourth gear is around volume tiered pricing discounts. So I've just got one simple example here. This involves the simple storage service, S3, which is our object storage. And it really just shows on the left-hand side, and this is the Canadian region pricing, that the first 50 terabytes every month of S3, you'd pay 2.5 cents per gigabyte per month. Once you get beyond 50 terabytes and into the next 450, you pay slightly less, 2.4 cents per gigabyte. And then over 500 terabytes per month, you're paying 2.3 cents. And in fact, for some of our larger customers who are dealing in the petabytes of size, it's possible to negotiate private pricing associated with that, right? So the more you use, the more you can save. And whatever kind of organization you are, small or large, you benefit in this same way. So now we understand that these things exist, right? These four capabilities exist. How do we think about using them to save money? So basically 5 big pillars to think about. We already talked about, or we're going to talk about right-sizing your instances, which is related to the auto-scaling piece that we talked about. We're going to talk about increasing elasticity, which again, using auto-scaling to bring on the resources that you want to use. We're going to talk about using the right pricing model, now that we understand what those pricing models are. How to match your usage to the correct storage class, because one of the great things about being in the cloud is you're not committed to a particular type of storage. There are multiple types that we'll talk about. They may be suited differently to different workloads, so you want to pick the right one, which means you need to understand a little bit more about it. And when you are able to take out some of the heavy lifting out of your work, right, the undifferentiated heavy lifting of building servers, implementing hardware, you can spend more time thinking. Now you're going to make better decisions around where to focus your efforts and where the costs are associated. And of course, you want to measure and monitor what you do and what you achieve in all ways. So we want to bring all these things together to help you make cost optimization decisions. I want you to be able to model this as well. Right? So the first step that people take is typically, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to migrate exactly what I've got to the cloud. It's a pure lift and shift. What does that look like? Have I got much savings? Well, typically, as the chart shows, there's no scale here, but you get the idea. Savings could be large, they could be small, but it's the starting point, right? If you are saying to yourself, I'm at the end of my journey on this cost optimization, you haven't thought through the whole process. So what else can you do? We're going to talk in a moment about instance right sizing and what that means, but basically a way of saying, for example, if you've taken a server with 16 cores and 128 gigabytes of RAM and you said, that's what I need today, that's what I need in the cloud. Well, okay, you migrate that over. Well, what if we said we had tools that could look at that and say, you don't need 16 and 128, you need 8 cores and you need 64 gigabytes of RAM to deliver the same performance, right? And the cost of that is half. You might say, well, that's interesting, right? So if you provision just on the basis of what you're used to provisioning, that may not be the right approach, right? We want you to look at that closely and take you through an example around instance right sizing. Elasticity, again, this is the election night example or the swimming lessons registration example, is the ability to add resources as they're needed and take them away when they're not. Storage optimization, we're going to use the right class of storage for the workload that we're working on. And that really plays into something we call CostConscious Design. When you do all those things, you get to what we would call an optimized lift and shift model in the cloud. And as the chart would suggest, you're probably about halfway there. Other things you want to think about, that ongoing measuring and monitoring, understanding from a financial governance standpoint, what you're spending, why you're spending it, where you have opportunities, low utilization, the opportunity to take action. I want you to consider looking at serverless architectures, if that makes sense to you, where there are still servers involved despite the name serverless, but they're entirely the responsibility of AWS in this case. You don't have to worry about the servers, you just have to worry about the outcomes. For example, if you stand up an API gateway and you have no traffic against it, you're paying no money for that. But if all of a sudden it's receiving thousands of hits every minute, you're going to be charged for the hits because you're going to be charged on an event basis for serverless compute. But you want to consider it as an opportunity. Lastly, implementing managed services that are offered either by AWS or some of our partner organizations. Again, take out some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting, focus on the outcomes of the programs that you want to deliver and the services that you want. And what you end up with, Scott, we will share these slides with you, but it's nice of you to take pictures. You end up with a re-platformed, AWS optimized approach. Right, so working through all these levers, and there is no cookie cutter formula, right? There's no, I can't hand you a white paper and say, here, read this, do the things in it, and you're done. It requires thought, it requires iteration, it requires learning. But this is the idea that we want to take you through, that the economic case improves as you go through all these optimization steps. And again, it is a journey. It's not something, we don't expect you to go home and do this tonight. But talking about right-sizing instances, let's have a look at that. So firstly, this is about selecting the cheapest instance available while meeting your performance requirements. Right? So you certainly want to look at CPU. You don't only want to look at the CPU, but you're looking to optimize, identify opportunities to identify instances that could be optimized, and you want to monitor them. I mentioned CloudWatch here, very important as we start to talk about auto scaling, right? But you're using the metrics available to you in CloudWatch, which is our monitoring tool, or setting up custom metrics of your own in CloudWatch, or even using a third-party tool. Some of the technology partners that we have very sophisticated tools. But understanding what's happening in your instances. So here's an example I'll just take you through for reducing cost by a right sizing. And the idea here that we just want to get across to you is use more smaller instances versus a smaller number of large instances. So over time, we're looking at a usage pattern. This is just a sample usage pattern. And let's put some servers in there, right? Some instances. Powerful thumb. So these gold bars here represent instances. And you can see here, these are what we call M5 large instances, about 11 cents an hour. And you can see the first few hours, we got 3 instances for the first 3 hours, fairly low utilization. The demand goes up, so we add in hour 4 another instance, fairly low utilization. But for hours 5 and 6 gets into quite high utilization. And then all of a sudden, hour 7, we need to add more resources. But you can see where the red bar crosses on the lower level of any of those instances, we have low utilization. Therefore, we have resource that we're paying for that we're not using. And the implication of those is 29 instance hours, so the M5 large, about $2,300 a month. So you can remember that number, and it'll stay on the chart. Well, what if we were to replace those with a different instance type that would achieve the same performance? So in this case, we're going to move to T2 medium instances. We're actually going to have to use almost twice as many of them, 59 versus 29. You can see the price on the right-hand side there, 5 cents an hour versus 11 cents, so they're cheaper. But what you can see is that the usage curve maps much more nicely to those instances. And if the usage spiked up, you could add another blue instance, you could add another blue instance, and so on. The financial implication of this, it's about $2,200 a month. So we've saved $100 a month. It's about 5%. But that's one workload, right? So for an organization that is running dozens or hundreds or thousands of workloads, every time you can find that kind of savings, it's adding up cumulatively. And if you were to speak to your boss and say, I've found a way to save you $10,000 or $20,000 a year, they probably would not be upset with you. So we'd certainly look at using smaller instance types and using auto scaling to deliver there. Another piece is workload scheduling. We referred to this a little bit already. If you've got a production workload, it's got to pretty much be running 24/7. It's going to cost what it's going to cost, right? And you're familiar with that, and you might use reserved instance pricing, but you know that you're going to pay for 100% of the time. But if you have a workload that you can operate 24 hours a day, Monday to Friday, if that is a possibility, you're going to save almost 30%. If you can reduce it to extended working hours, you're going to save 65% versus your 24/7 cost. And if you can run it just Monday to Friday, as with the stock exchange example, saving almost 70% of your usage. Now, predominantly this makes sense for non-production workloads, right? It's dev, it's test, it's any sort of pre-prod workloads, probably not your production workloads. Depending on the industry that you're in. But it could be HR systems. It could be systems that are only turned on infrequently to deliver on specific programs. So understanding your needs in terms of service delivery to your employees, to your citizens, and being in a position to turn off resources, we want to encourage you to do so. Now that can be a little bit complicated. So one of the services that we do have is something called AWS Instance Scheduler. And again, there are partner solutions that'll do something similar to this. But here's a focus on, this is a pre-built, templated AWS solution that allows you to start and stop resources. And you can tag resources to identify those which should be started and stopped. And basically it rolls out with CloudFormation, which is templating, which you may have heard about earlier today. But the idea is stand it up quickly. Every 5 minutes, it polls against those resources to see which ones should be started and stopped, and it does so, right? So in the event that you have resources that you can turn off and you understand your pattern of usage and you want to implement this, go ahead and do that. Save some money. So storage classes, we talked about this already. I'm just going to fly all these in here. 6 different types of storage classes in AWS. Simple Storage Service, or S3, is our object storage. Highly performant, highly scalable, low-cost object storage, so files, videos, pictures. Glacier, which is related to S3, the ability to take all those S3 objects and archive them at significantly lower cost. If you need storage that connects to your instances, that's Elastic Block Store, or EBS, right? So it's a block-level device. Storage Gateway offers the opportunity to serve up from your on-prem into AWS, whether it's file, disk, tape. Elastic File System, which is shared among instances, and CloudFront, which is our content delivery network. The question I'd put to you is, you've got items that you need to have stored. Have you thought about what kind of storage they need to be in order to deliver the outcome for those constituents, right? So thinking about this, because they all have different cost characteristics, and again, we talk about cost-conscious design, this is something where there are choices in AWS. You can deliver service multiple ways to get the same outcome, but it's important to understand there's different cost profiles for those different services, and you want to sit down, whether it's with AWS Account Manager, Solution Architect, our ProServe organization, maybe even one of our partner organizations, to talk about, this is the outcome I want to achieve. These are the choices I'm willing to look at or be educated about those choices, and then make decisions that make, again, the most economic sense and let you deliver that service. But this is a really key thing, just understanding that not all storage is exactly the same in terms of delivering in the cloud. We mentioned serverless architectures earlier, and we have 5 minutes left. Just very quickly on this, no servers for you to manage, extremely flexible on scaling. You're going to pay on events. Everything that's serverless in AWS is designed for high availability, right? So the goal is for you never to see any downtime, and very importantly, zero idle capacity, right? So there is no capacity that you are not paying for. So certainly something worth exploring with some of those experts. Monitoring all these resources. So I'll fly all these in as well. You've got the ability to monitor your resources in the cloud and really understand in real time or close to real time what your utilization looks like. And you've also got the ability to set alarms that give you information about your spend, about your performance, about the health of your resources. You can monitor those resources. We provide a large number of them to you. You can also establish your own custom metrics and, of course, publish those out to whatever format you want to report in. But you've got the ability to graph that and to look at statistics and so on, and programmatically react react to any of the resource changes. So very, very important to understand that you can really see into what you're doing and do something about it. And I've mentioned before that that's on the front end of auto-scaling, right? Understanding that if you've set the trigger that a certain CPU utilization, you'll launch another resource, right? Or if you get to a certain point, you take out resources, and that's all done on an automated basis. So you can monitor that while focusing your attention on other things and take cost out at the same time. So we really do want you to establish metrics and targets. We want you to set those KPIs that make the most sense for your particular workload, right? And we've given some examples here what some of those might be, the percentage of instances that you turn off or the percentage of instances that you will right size. Where do you want to be on your reserved instances? And this is, I think, really key. We want you not to spend money that you don't need to spend. So for example, if you purchase reserved instances for us, one of the capabilities that we give to you is to understand your utilization against that reserved instance, basically a coupon book, right? A pricing coupon book. Have you used all your coupons? They will eventually expire, right? So we want you to have visibility to that so that you have not purchased something which you do not use. Very, very key. And so it all works backwards associated with CloudWatch and other tools that we'll talk about here. Two final tools. Trusted Advisor. Many of you probably are not familiar with Trusted Advisor, but what this does, it's an automated service that runs in AWS. If you're on business support or enterprise support, there's no cost associated with it. It does approximately 56 different checks against cost, performance, security, and the health of your resources. Right, the resiliency of your resources, and it gives you proactively specific recommendations about things that you should do. This chart's a bit hard to read, but on the cost optimization pillar specifically, which is the top right-hand corner, one of the things that it points out is that out of your 15 RDS instances that you are using, 11 of them appear to be idle. So what that means is 11 different instances doing nothing or at an extremely low utilization. Getting a flag that says, you should probably look at this, is a trigger that lets you go and see, could I be resizing those instances? Could I somehow be consolidating? What can I do? Because we're going to tell you, it says right here, there's a potential annual savings here of $2,738. That's probably going to matter to you, right? So the performance and the security and the health and so on, the fault tolerance, all extremely important to you. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to tell you, you're spending money on things that you probably don't need to. And again, because you're not building servers, you can spend more time thinking about how can I not expend this money, right? So we want you to have that choice. And similarly, Cost Explorer, which is a financial service available in our cost and billing dashboard within the management console, it's going to give you extremely fine-grained visibility into what you're spending where. And depending how you've set it up, presumably you're using tagging to identify resources and tag them back to either resource groups or to program areas, organizational units within your organization, cost centers. Lets you understand exactly what you're spending. In fact, maybe who is spending what, and it lets you drill down into that. Again, there are third-party tools, but Cost Explorer is pretty richly featured. Gives you the opportunity to really see it, make decisions. And I remember speaking to one federal customer who said, I'm a bit worried I will overspend the budget that I've set aside. You can set alarms in Cost Explorer as fine-grained as you like. In this particular case, they had a monthly budget and they set weekly targets, and they did alarming against those weekly targets, and they haven't missed their targets, right? So it gives you the visibility that you need. So these are all tools we want you to be aware of and use so that you can get into what we call cost-conscious design, which is, again, making decisions that make sense financially. And so for those who aren't customers today, some things to consider about looking at your organization, would you benefit from the ability to trade capital expense for variable expense, right? If so, this may be for you. Would your organization basically, would you benefit from speed and agility to get products, programs to market faster? Could you benefit from the economies of scale? Would you rather focus on development of your service, your products, your programs versus data center management? Would it be helpful to stop guessing capacity? And in the case of those organizations which have a broader outlook than a specific city or geography, is it helpful to make this broadly available to people? If the answer to one or more of those questions is yes, there may be something in AWS to look at from a cost perspective. But for our existing customers, really call to action on a few things. Really ask you, as I said today, of the instances you're running, could you right-size any of them, right? We'd like to reduce your bill on AWS, and that might seem strange, but we really would. Is there a way to have better utilization of the resources you're using on AWS? Could you benefit from reserved instances? You want to make sure you understand your usage, but that is out there. How many of your instances do need to be running 24/7, or could you look at instance scheduling? Encourage you to do that. And lastly, are you using auto-scaling or not? So many events where this is just a really simple architectural pattern. Set it up once. It's not, none of this in AWS is set and forget, especially in the area of cost optimization. But we certainly want you to have as much automation as possible, as much simplicity as possible, so you can focus on the higher order activities in your programs. So with that said, all of our pricing is available online for the on-demand reserved instance pricing. It's available by service on our website, very easy to see. We have an online, the simple monthly calculator, we refer to it as, which allows you to basically do cost estimates up front, understand based on your estimates of usage what your costs would be. We'd be happy to help you with that, any of our team. We have an online TCO calculator. Perhaps more importantly, we have a complete cloud economics center with a lot of resources available to you. So these resources are out there. We encourage you to read and ask questions and make use of them. And with that, I want to thank you very much. There is an opportunity right after this session to mix, mingle, and have a relaxing drink. We hope it's been a really successful day for you. And thank you so much for your time.